Economists expect convergence. Four factors lead them to do so: factor price equalization, ideas non-rivalry, the power of the market as a societal Babbage engine, and government's very strong incentives to play the game of governance in a positive sum way. Thus, economists keep on expecting prosperity to spread and become general. And yet it did not happen as far as the global south was concerned between 1910 and 1990. As of 1990, China and India were perhaps 50% richer than they'd been back in 1910. Perhaps. But they were much further behind the global north than they had been in 1910. There were no signs that they were in any sense catching up. They were by far failing to even match the pace. The technology gap between what you'd see on the ground in China and India in 1990 and what you saw in the global north then was immensely greater than the technology gap had been back in 1910. Why was this the case? Well, when Harry Truman and others decided to turn some of the attention of the United States government to problems of international development in the 1940s, they were very optimistic, for there had been up to that point a standard package for successful economic development. It needed a market-promoting government building railroads, canals, and ports. It needed the chartering of banks for commerce and investment to mobilize savings and grease transactions. It needed the establishment of mass public education. It needed the imposition of smart tariffs on manufactured imports, but only in those sectors where you might plausibly rapidly attain a comparative advantage, in order to nurture the creation of the communities of engineering practice needed to take advantage of the non-rival global storehouse of useful technological ideas. But all of this seemed a straightforward and a very doable project, and indeed in some places it was done. That is, there were some convergers up until 1990, like Italy, Portugal, Japan, and South Korea. Admittedly, they were a very odd group, that very few in 1910 or 1950 would have picked them out, as in any sense predestined to become members of the global rich. And the point to stress is that such convergers were rare. Let's take a look at the Americas. In the Americas, there were many disappointments. There was Jamaica, with what looked like very good market and governmental institutions, albeit an astonishingly unequal income distribution, when it left the British Empire. Yet Jamaica zigged with a huge investment in the energy-intensive aluminum industry in the 1970s, just as the global economy zagged and energy became hideously expensive. Jamaica found itself unable to deliver on promises of social democracy made to the electorate on the basis of expected rapid prosperity and growth, just as lenders and investors demanded their money back with interest. And then the interest owed went way up, as Paul Volcker at the U.S. Federal Reserve decided that fighting global inflation was more important than maintaining global full employment. But it was not just Jamaica. The United States and Argentina seemed much more alike than either was like Jamaica in 1910, but by 1990 it was Jamaica and Argentina that were classified together, both members of the Global South. And then there was Africa. Most of Africa before 1960 seemed to be doing as well as much of Latin America, and definitely better than much of Asia. Not so much after 1960 outside of cultural revolution-afflicted China, and definitely not so much after 1975, including China. Now, don't overstate the failure that after 1950, the Global South did grow from a center of gravity of perhaps $3.50 a day as a living standard in 1950 to $6 or cents a day as a living standard in 1975. But this growth did not match the pace of growth in the global north, and so up until 1975 the relative income gap widened further. Now the gap for countries stopped widening after 1975. Pick a country at random in 1990 or even today, and on average it is about as far behind the global north in relative terms as it was in 1975. And as for people, well, China and India are 1/3 of the human race, and they have done very, very well indeed since 1980. But on the other hand, do not oversell progress. Africa, for example, has fallen way, way behind in relative terms, a thing not expected back in 1960, with perhaps most discouraging in the generation after African independence was the substantial fall in the production of export crops. So, why the failures once the colonial burden was lifted? Was it just that governments turned out to be made up of thieves? Cynical demagogues interested not in national prosperity, but only in their own large bank accounts in the Cayman Islands and elsewhere? To some degree, yes. But even rule by a thief, a stationary bandit, as my old teacher, the late Mansur Olson, used to say, should not block economic growth. Wherever government is stable and secure enough that it does not require draining resources from the rest of society to maintain its politicians in office and provide order for its supporters, the interests of the thieves at the top and the people are aligned, and economic growth can and should take place. So the question is then, why have governments in the global south been unstable and insecure enough that they do require themselves to drain resources from the rest of society on a growth-destroying scale? Now, my view, and this is not in any way the consensus, is that regime building is hard. A government that is going to maintain its rule in a stable manner needs to have supporters, and those supporters need to be rewarded. But in a poor country, rewards for supporters that the government can access do not grow on trees. Consider the English government, the building of the English state and the English economy. The English government in the early modern period could use the Protestant Reformation in religion to seize the 1/3 of land that belonged to the church, hand that land out to its supporters, and then be seen as providing the essential navy to protect those landholders from Catholic French or Stuart dynasty threats, and the navy that also brought the wealth of global commerce to Bristol and Portsmouth and Liverpool, and then the government could further hand out the profits of empire to its supporters. But other countries did not have the luxury of such a lucky position, or the luxury of such a length of time. And remember that England had 4 civil wars in the period between 1600 to 1750. Demanding that countries achieve an anti-colonial revolution, a democratic revolution, successful state building, and industrialization to produce general prosperity in 1 or 2 generations, that seems to me to be asking a lot. And then there was the role played by ideology. There were many, many people in the global south and in the global north who were very eager for governments that would put in place their ideology, rather than focus on practical tasks of mobilizing resources and increasing wealth. Now, perhaps I'm being unfair. Perhaps the ideologists were also blinded by what their studies of old books had told them must absolutely be true, that they could not imagine that there could possibly be a conflict between putting their ideas into practice at the points of guns and actually having a, prosperous country. But whether it was Friedrich Hayek calling for bloody right-wing military rule, because allowing rule by a party of even the center-left British Labour Party's complexion would inevitably put a society on the road to serfdom, or a Noam Chomsky glorifying the land nationalizations and city emptyings of the Vietnamese and Cambodian communist parties, it was not going to go well. And indeed, in much of the global south from 1910 to 1990, it did not go well. It did not go well